afternoon. Here we are again at the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society evening series talking about post-Indian agriculture in the town of Dartmouth. And continuing in his series of discussions on agriculture, we have Claude Ledoux. Tonight's talk is about the 20th century local farming, and he will be telling us about many of the different aspects of that period. Thanks again for coming, Claude Ledoux.
Hi, Claude Ledoux, Westport resident. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about farming during the 1950s or during the 20th century. It's the third part of a series that went back to the colonial, through the colonial stages, back to the Indian. So there's 3 separate lectures. This is the last one. I want to thank Dartmouth Community TV, Derek Freites, and Jason Pertami from the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society for providing the technical help to bring this to you. I had a little bit of a somewhat torture about this particular lecture because there was so much to it. I tried to cut it down, and I did quite a bit, but by going through too much cutting, we were losing the main information and the stuff that's important. So I decided to keep a lot of the detailed stuff in here. I hope it's not too boring for you, but a shortened version would miss too much of the important stuff. So, my summary is that all conditions of civilizations throughout the ages have been dictated by the food types and availability of food to that civilization. The lifestyles and food needs of people are interdependent. The nurturing of plants and animals, farming, is intimately dependent on the amounts and types of available agricultural lands, the size of the farm, the type of soil, the temperature, the climate, and so on. We're going to deal with local farming in our part of New England, especially Westport and Dartmouth. Okay, a brief review of the progression of farming eras. I have summarized 7 time frames into 3 separate distinct agricultural styles. Part 1, which would have been lecture 1, agriculture developed during the ages of Indian natives, and remember we're talking about local ag, up to the mid-1600s, before stone walls. Food variety promoted healthy lifestyles and a near-perfect harmony with the natural world for the Indians. The local Indian populations were very fortunate in living in a place where they could have food from the sea, the streams, forest, and from the slash and burn agriculture. Part 2, colonial farming, was from the first white farmers from 1600 to 1840. They distinguished the agriculture from the Indian communal to stone wall and private land ownerships. Large farmsteads, denuding of the land at times, animal husbandry, a very important change from the Indians, sheep browsing, which helped to control brush, population growth, which helped to market food products, and it affected agriculture tremendously. Now, the colonial farming also introduced grain and hops. The colonials liked their beer, hops were needed for that, and the colonials also imported a lot of the seed stocks and fruit stocks, grain stuff from Europe when they developed the agriculture in this country. The national era from the 1840s to early 1900s included the First World War. Farmsteads grew smaller due to multiple inheritances and or sales. Bulldozers, stone crushers. There was a stone crusher at the Goldstein farm, the remnants of one, when we moved to this country from Canada in 1949. That old stone crusher structure was still there, not being used anymore, but the structure was still there with remnants of stone laying all over the place. This was the Goldstein farm on what was then Beulah Road and later named Gifford Road. The stone crushers produced crushed stone, and combined with tar, this was used to what they call macadamized roads. You can look that up in the old town reports. And basically it just was stones laid on the ground, laid on a roadbed and flooded with tar. Very durable. The expanding populations also marked the national era. Bigger markets for farm products, and there was also a big ethnic farming influx of people. Part two would be the industrial era of the country from the 1850s to 1950s, including Second War years, more machinery, new equipment types, hay rather than nut S kickers, increased food production, increased food demands rather, and the United States saving and feeding the whole world. Part three would include the 40s and 50s era, the height of local farming, loose hay, manure cellar barns, stanchion barns. Evolution of all of this barn type was at its peak usage. The 1960s started the rapid farm decline, disappearing to open barn, specialized farming techniques, self-sustaining farms promoted by lack of welfare and farm subsidies marked the 40s and 50s era. Post-industrial era, from the 80s to now, there was an increase in open land preservation, at times promoting land to grow fallow. In other words, programs that bought producing land allowed that land to just grow fallow and start growing brush again, and eventually turned back to forest, not within our lifetime. Precipitous decline in farm numbers also accompany the post-industrial era. 1980s to now, the future of farming in our local area looks pretty dismal. Food imports dominate our food supplies, and the cost to establish a farm is astronomical, unaffordable for working class means people. Now we'll track my journey through agriculture. It's fairly representative of other journeys of the times. For 80 years, I've been fortunate to live, learn, and been involved in agrarian life in my native Quebec and Westport. And throughout my working life, I was able to witness food production over the different parts of this country, Europe and Asia. So I'm drawing from my experience and my research in various literature to give you a feel for how we got to where we are with local farming. Our family, parents and 8 children, immigrated from Quebec province in '49. I was oldest at 13 years old. 13 generations removed from the first Ledoux, Louis Ledoux, to come to Canada in 1668. Okay. Now this is a picture of my family when there were 7 members, and you can see by the ladder descent from right to left of the ages of each child. I call this French-Canadian production. The English in Canada call it the revenge of the cradle by the French population. Okay. The next slide would be, this is a super model of a work sled in the forests of Canada at the time, where they were using this for pulpwood production. And it's a scale model made by one of my uncles to exact details. The horses are a scale model of the Clyde breed, which is the biggest workhorse breed in the world. And a lot of people, well, I'm reminded how the things had been developed to such a fine degree in all of this stuff. And one of the things that brings it out is that horse harnesses actually include brake straps, which most people today would not realize. And that was necessary when you were going downhill for the horses to, what I call put the brakes on, to prevent these wagons from rolling over them. So remember, brake straps, if you ever want to look at a horse harness, that's a good thing to look for. Okay. This is an example of some of the Quebec lifestyle of, say, 1940. Very lightweight buggies were sometimes used with some pretty good sized dogs to drag people around from one place to another. Worked very well, actually, as long as there were no cats around for the dogs to get excited about. The bottom picture is a picture of our early family, myself and two of my siblings, with my father and mother, about 1938. So we settled on a small Westport farm on the corner of Mouse Mill and Beulah Road, surrounded by an agrarian society similar to the one we had left. The main difference was that here the farms were owned by a variety of populations. We had Polish, Portuguese, Jewish, Yankee, French-Canadian, Russians, and other nationalities, all very distinct. They got along super because they might talk different language, but farmers are the same all over the world. There's chores, there's work, and both of those have a lot of similarity. And the fact that there was a different population, but we were still in an agrarian society, made life here, an immigrant's life, much easier to adapt to. So I'm going to show you next a map of Beulah Road, Gifford Farms, now Gifford Road, the farms, that just in a small section of Westport. I'm going to show you just how many farms that there were in just that little section of Westport, close to Route 6. And I'll follow that with a Mouse Mill Pond building remnants. Mouse Mill was on our land, and had been used for grain grinding and ice storage. A beautiful bulwark dam, earthen dam, with a controlled spillway, and it was a very good setup. Another thing I want to mention is that at the time, something unusual, something that we were not used to, became familiar, and that was margarine. In Canada, we always had butter, and yet there was, of course, butter down here, but margarine was much cheaper. It was, some of you might remember, it was in a plastic bag filled with some creamy type liquid with a little red ball of some kind of mixture, and you squeezed the whole thing together, broke the ball, and kept squeezing this bag until it became a margarine that you could put on your bread and have much cheaper than butter at the time. I don't know how many of you would remember this particular margarine, but I thought I'd mention it because it struck my mind as one of the new things we became familiar with. Okay, we look at the farms now on Gifford Road. Um, from the top, coming down, there was way up at the top, near the letter O, was the Oliveira Dairy Farm, a small dairy farm. Coming down to the next step in between the below that farm would be the Francis Poultry Farm. Then we would come down Gifford Road or Beulah Road down to about where it says S1, and across the street from that would be the Costa Farm. Now, the farms I'm showing you now were all destroyed by Route 88. 88 knifed through those farmlands and essentially put the farmers out of business because they couldn't get to their productive land or to the barns and stuff like that that were on the other side. So the Costas were in a dire strait. They were a strong family farm, boys and girls, and Mr. Costa, Royal Costa, his name was. They moved to Horseneck Road, where the Buzzards Bay Brewery is now. That was the Costa farm when they moved from Gifford Road. So I'm going to keep coming down now. Across from M was the Goldstein farm, and the Goldsteins were cattle dealers and animal dealers. They dealt in all kinds of animals and cows. I worked for them for quite a while, taking care of the barn. We were milking about 60 cows at the time, and the Goldsteins traded in all kinds of livestock. They went to the Brighton stockyards. At the time, Brighton was a very big slaughtering house and animal trading center. So the Goldsteins used to go up there once or twice a week when they had enough animals and do trading and sell their stock at auction. Coming down further from the Goldsteins between M and P, across the road again on Beulah Road, was the Allard Farm, which was a small dairy farm. A lot of these farms, by the way, still used draft horses for the work. The Allards were part of that. And coming back down from Allard, right across from P, was the small Ledoux farm, about 12 acres, and that included Mouse Mill Pond, which would be at the intersection of the two roads. Roughly in here. So Mouse Mill Road was, the Mouse Mill Pond would be over here. Coming down further, we would go to the Semensky Farm. Semensky Farm was a big farm, giant area. It was a big farm. Now it's 12 Pond Acres, the Dias developments, and the Billy Ferreira developments are all essentially on the Semensky Farm, what used to be the Semensky Farm. So in just that small area, you had a tremendous amount of farming. So it gives you an idea of how much farming there must have been in Westport at the time. Now coming down further, down here, where 177 is Trout Pond. Mouse Mill drained a piece of 88, drained 88 all the way back to Briggs Road, and flowed over into Bread and Cheese Brook, which fed Trout Pond, and kept going to the head of Westport to feed the Mill Pond, which was a beautiful pond, about 40 acres in area. Okay. Go to the next slide. This is, I'm not trying to show off, that I was fairly good looking when I was small. My 13-year-old picture after coming from Canada, and we had started, one of my uncles had a giant chicken farm in Swansea and a grain dealership. So we used to deliver grain, my father and I, to Dighton, Rehoboth, Warren, Bristol, Westport, Fall River, Assonet. We used to deliver grain all over the place. And one of the things with the grain, it was always packed at the time in 100-pound bags. So that's what we handled all day. But the bags, Glidden Grain had some beautiful cotton bags with prints, very well done, of different type. And the farm women used to use these cotton bags for making dresses for the girls, and they made dresses for the shirts for the boys. And this is a picture of me in a grain bag shirt. I don't think you'll ever see that again around. But these grain bags were very useful for making these clothing for the farm kids. One of the things about the production, let's go to the next slide now. I want to make a note that when we delivered grain, we would stack up the truck early in the morning and load it up. First load off to the last load back to front. We would then, when we got to a farm and delivered grain, the worst thing that could happen was for the housewife to come out of the house, because she might be looking for a particular print to finish a dress that she had started or something. So, and if that print happened to be in the middle part of the load, we had to unload a lot of grain to get to the prints that she wanted. So seeing the housewife was not a welcome sight when we were delivering grain. Okay, we'll go to the next slide now. So I just to sum up, a typical day, typical farm of the day. I started my work career at 55 years. My work career started at 13 and went on for 55 years. On the Bourke Farm, about a mile up from our home, Bourke Farm was on Mouse Mill Road. My pay was $1 a day, and this was actually a fortunate thing because the Bourkes were French-Canadian immigrants. The farming and lifestyle and language was similar to what we had in Canada, so it made adaptation to this country much easier. It was a typical self-sustaining farm of the day, perfect fit with the size and type of its land, as most other farms of the day. And I'm going to be using that farm, the Bourke Farm, as a model in the following talk about farming during the 40s and to the 70s, which was the height of the industrial era farm numbers in our area. The reason I'm using this is because I was intimately familiar with its process, with the details. My father and I delivered 100-pound grain bags in a process, and in the process got to know the families we served. Some I remember in Dartmouth were the Martells on Old County Road, the Suburans who lived down the road further on Old County, and one of their daughters lived in a surplus World War II Quonset hut. Their names were Sabourin. The Quonset huts were left over from World War II at the time, and they were sold very cheap if you wanted to drive to Newport and Quonset and tear them down and take them to wherever you wanted to use them. They were a very, very good structure and very cheap to make a quick house with, and used as Quonset huts were used as a first home for many young couples. Okay, the customers of French-Canadian ancestry were mostly associated with the chicken and turkey business, so the types of grain supplies reflected this. There was a starting mash, a growing mash, egg-laying mash, crushed oyster shells. People would say, why would you want crushed oyster shells? Well, that's for chickens and birds. They have a gizzard digesting system, and they need these stones, and crushed oyster shells were just right for the gizzard operation. Special supplies were also required at times, feeders and little Brutus stoves to heat up the chicks, to warm the chicks up while they were growing, and different tools. The printed grain bags. We've already talked about the grain bags and how they caused so much extra work for us. Now, in the process, you see, the fortunate thing is that we acquired an intimate knowledge of area farms, the families and their ethnicities, Portuguese, Polish, Russian, Jewish, Yankee, French, Canadian, Cape Verdeans. Cape Verdeans, throughout the rest of my life, as I always witnessed when we met Cape Verdeans, they were always very hard-working people. And there weren't many involved in farming at the time, but they all ran beautiful farms. Syrians in Fall River, we also delivered grains to. So this interaction bred a lot of understanding about who was here, what they were doing, what they looked like, what their customs were. And although there was such a variety of people, everybody got along pretty well. The understanding was that in the outside world, when you were in your own community, you spoke the language, you followed the customs. But in the outside world, everybody followed English because it was considered impolite to be talking your own language in front of people that did not understand it. So English was the common derivative to put things together. Okay? So another fairly common path that farm boys followed is I joined the Marine Corps at 16. I was still a Canadian citizen, and as I was for many years after. The Korean War was on, and a lot of boys were joining the services. I just happened to pick the Marine Corps at the time. I joined at 16, but I had to wait till I was 17 in order to make the trip. It was a 20-hour train ride from Fall River to Parris Island. It was a totally new perspective for a 17-year-old for the first time in his life being on his own, observing the changes in people, the scenery, lifestyles, life along the tracks, the switchings in Boston and New York. All of that became an unforgettable learning experience and a very questioning one. My father delivered me to the Fall River train station, and during his last handshake at the time, he said in French, "Fais-nous fiers," which means make us proud. And then I went to the train and was gone. So I'm going to show you a picture now of the day before I left for Parris Island. And I'm giving you all this stuff to back up the typical people involved that would have been involved in agriculture of the day locally. So the top picture is my father and the 5 boys the day before I left for the Marine Corps. The bottom picture is the church of my baptism in Drummondville, Canada. All business where we came from was done in French. Schooling, everything else. Many people still doubt that I can speak English. Okay? Okay, now that I've laid out some background, we're going to go to the 1950s local farming era, which was the most important era of the industrial age, of the industrial era in this country, where we fed the world and we defended the whole world. So the 50s were after the Second War and during the Korean War years. This is the area that I'm going to concentrate on. The machinery was becoming very efficient, very specialized, and really productive. There were many new equipment types. Stone removal was done on a grand scale during the 50s. In Westport, it was by John Santos and Mr. Cabral. They had excavating businesses, and they had giant bulldozers. And they were busy all the time removing stones from the land to make the fields unobstructed by a multitude of small fields bordered by stone walls. They made giant fields that could make use of this new machinery when you put the plow down, it might be 4 or 5 bottoms, and it would go. You wanted to make it productive, so you didn't want interfering stone walls. Much of the stone walls were buried. Ditches were dug next to the walls, the stones were buried and covered over. And you can still see the remnants of some of these burials during the growing seasons, because wherever the stones are buried is a little drier, of course, because there's a channel for water, and the topsoil is a little drier. Sometimes a little lower, because it's settled amongst the stones. So this was an area where farming was really revolutionized to increase production. This was, again, to sum up, it was the height of local self-sustaining farm. Loose hay, manure cellars, stanchion barns was at its peak, and this was not only true of our local area, but much of the New England. Okay. So, as in all the years dating back to the Indians, local foods at the time of, even in the 50s, were mostly consumed locally, with markets to local populations, and very little of our food shipped any further. One exception I can think of was that where Mid-City steel is now, where Mid-City scrap metal is now rather, that started out as a giant slaughterhouse during the Second War years and many years after, because it had a railroad siding, and they could ship their products out fairly cheap, quick, and receive products fairly cheap and quick. So the slaughterhouse at Mid-City, with its railroad siding, was one outfit that shipped that did a lot of shipment to to areas out of the local area. So after the lean times of the Depression, the 40s, the war years, started a time of prosperity for farmers, because they could not keep up with food production. They just could not produce enough for the demand of the market. The production was wall to wall, and there was also a lot of black market meats going on. I remember some old timers telling me that at night you could hear pigs squealing all over the woods of Westport being slaughtered, and snuck into the city on the hay or whatever the next day. Okay? I can't remember the name of those farmers, by the way. So local farm numbers peaked from 40 to 60, spurred by World War II. Daily life on all farm types was and is governed by chores and work. I want to make a distinction between the two, because they're very different. Chores, they're a constant daily repetition and have to be done whether you're tired, sick, cold, warm, absent, or even dead. And the chores vary depending on the type of farming. For dairy animals, animals are assembled, fed, milked, checked for turnout if weather permits, barns cleaned, products stored, the milk would be stored in the milk house, horses ready for the day, for the work coming up. A jug of fresh milk would be carried into the house for the day's breakfast and the day's supply, fresh warm milk, and that would be the morning, one of the chores of the men involved in milking the cows. Breakfast was after morning chores. Supper was after evening chores. 12-hour days were normal, interrupted by an hour for dinner, which was usually followed pretty religiously. You needed a break for an hour or so, sitting in the shade in the summer under a tree outside the house, and just kibitzing, and the old timers smoking their pipes and stuff like that. Shade time would be about a half hour, and it was a good, enjoyable relaxation time in between the heat of the day and the sweating and sore muscles. Sometimes, periodically rather, extra milk would be brought in, left to stand for the cream to be used later, stand so the cream would rise up, and the cream would be used to churn butter. Butter churns were a job for young boys to keep turning. Okay, chores. This is a typical chore, grain feeding the cows. You see, when the cows are loose in the pasture, they just don't want to come in. But they'll come in at the appointed time when they know the grain's going to be fed. The stanchions would be open. Each cow would find its own place. They didn't like to find another cow in their place. So they would sort themselves out to their own area. The stanchions would be closed up so they couldn't get back out, and they would be fed a small portion of grain while the milking would take place, morning and night. Okay. Here's some very good example of cows which would be freshened. In other words, it just gave birth to a calf very recently. You can tell by the size of the udder. And in this case, instead of hand milking, this must be a big operation here. The manure gutter is in the back, just outside the edge of the picture, down here. And he's getting ready to put on a surge machine milking that goes up that goes up the line to a pipe, a common pipe that brings the milk all the way to the milk room, and it goes through a filter and straight into the milk cooler. That's a more modern operation and not one for very many small farms. But these cows are really good milkers, probably getting maybe 100 pounds of milk a day, probably. Fantastic. Okay. Now, one of the things, the first instinct of a cow is to get loose when a calf is born, and most farms usually provided a separate little enclosure for a cow to give birth, because it was always better for the cow and the calf, because she could attend to the motherly duties, which are very helpful for the cow, and not only for the cows but for the calf. So this here is a calf that was born alone with the cow when she was untethered by a stanchion. The best way to do it was this way. Okay. Hand milking. Mr. Bork and I milked about 24 of 28 cows by hand twice a day. That's a good way to build strong hands and forearms. Now, the milking by hands was, you see, this is a very clean operation. You can tell by the cow. This is most likely a Jersey cow. The udder is smaller, but the milk is richer. And this guy is very clean. And this is a more upscale operation here. Super clean, I would say. Good operation. You see, he's sitting on a small stool, and typically you would put your head in front of the cow's leg and between the abdomen and the leg, and if she was going to kick, you could kind of feel it and just push her off balance a little bit so she wouldn't kick the bucket. If she didn't like what you were doing, she would kick this bucket and empty the milk out, and that was not a good thing. Okay, next one. All right, the smaller barns of the 50s with manure cellars had trap doors. You might wonder how do you put the manure in a cellar? Well, you had a hook and you dug through the manure and lifted the trap door at different parts of the gutter and shoveled all the manures into the gutter, and then you closed the trap door. Usually you would not empty the manure out until sometimes in the winter when the ground was frozen, but usually early spring would be the best, because you would lose a minimum amount of nitrogen by allowing the ground to be thawed and the manure nutrients to leak into the ground. So to remove the manure, it was necessary to stand in the manure, usually with hip boots, about 2.5 feet deep, and fill it in the manure spreader that had been backed into the cellar with a manure fork a typical manure fork full of manure would probably be about 50 pounds. So when a manure spreader was full, it was taken to the fields to be spread. The methane in the air was stifling. The liquid mix, which would have been cow urine, was also mixed with the manure, and that was loaded into barrels with buckets and pushed over in the fields at different area after having been dragged there in a stone boat, a flat affair. So I'm going to show you the next slide is a firstborn calf, and the mother on the right is dropping her placenta. Cows in the stanchions, when calving, and these cows are trapped in a stanchion, would be anxious to be released so they could get to the calf and begin to lick the birth fluids and get familiar. This calf dropped into the gutter manure, and the cow was still tethered. So this was a situation where you might come a few hours later and find this condition, the calf staying close to the mother. And when you release that cow from that stanchion, you better be the hell out of the way, because she'll run you right over. So you have to be careful of that. But a freshened cow's milk is not used for human consumption. It's too rich and too loaded with all kinds of minerals and all kinds of, it's a very nourishing mixture. So you usually let the calves have that milk, and the leftover, which would be too much for that calf, would be used to feed the pigs and fatten pigs. So nothing got wasted. Okay? Now, I'm not going to list all of this. I just want to give you a rough idea of what work consisted of from my memory, the things that would be considered work, which variation throughout the seasons. Some things would be in season, some things not, but it would all involve things that had to be conscious of and kept up with. This is 26 tasks, and I may have forgotten some, but the next one, one that I forgot is the periodic cleaning of the outhouse. And that was always a not so pleasant, but not frequent necessity. Okay? I'm going to go to the next slide. I want to make a point that these farms were truly a family operation, from the smallest kids to the oldest person, and male or female. There was always a partnership. It didn't need to be spoken about. You grew into it automatically. It was a need to feel useful and satisfied that you had helped with the welfare of the whole farm and the whole family. So women were busy doing certain things which were very important, and if they were not done, you would know it. If they were done, you would not know it. Men were busy doing other things, and it was always this feeling of being an important member, of being an important contributor, was always there, which was a great thing because it kept the farm going and it kept the family prosperous and growing in a very cooperative manner. So I want to make sure that I mention this a useful practice. See, nobody in those days had air conditioning. Electricity was very expensive, sometimes non-existent, and a useful practice to deal with the summer heat was to use the house cellar for daily activities. Cellars had dirt floor with an area of wooden platform for a small kitchen stove, a table, and things like that, and even a bed. Ground temperatures kept the cellars cool. Ground temperature can be 50 to 55 degrees, so the cellar was a cool place, natural, and a little bit of moisture seeping out of the ground was great for keeping potatoes and other things in good shape. The small kitchen stove was fired up briefly with small wood pieces to prepare noon meals with a minimum warming contribution. Okay. So farm life was often from childhood to grave. Children were eager to contribute, and they started with small tasks at a very young age. A self-sustaining farm of the day supported and needed two families, one older and one younger couple. That was a good arrangement. Stacking hay in a summer hayloft in a loose hay barn could be about 120-degree temperature, and the combination of the sweat and hay dust would leave one with rivulets of sweat visible throughout the dust. Some rites of passage for a young man was when he could put a full 40-quart milk can in and out of the cooler, which would involve lifting it from the floor to about 3.5 feet, and then dropping it into a cooler, and of course removing it later when it was time for the truck to come and pick it up to take to the dairy. Also, picking up a 100-pound grain bag from the floor and swing it onto your shoulder and walk away with it, that was another milestone. A younger milestone was when a youngster could successfully lock a load of hay to keep it from spilling up off the wagon. That was a little tricky stuff that you did when the hay was picked up in a field loose, in big loose round balls, and put it onto the hay wagon. If it wasn't locked properly, when the wagon got loaded quite high, maybe 6 or 7, 8 feet, the hay would fall apart if you went over a bump in the field. So locking the hay and being able to do all of these things good meant a lot to growing youngsters. It was a good life. Okay, now we're going to see some pictures of the book farm, and it shows the proudness and the usefulness of having horses to do your work, to help with the work, because a good horse was always something that was treasured. The homestead, first level, second level, cellar, all pretty typical and very comfortable. Wood heat, of course. Youngsters, along with the older people, the work progression shows the family cohesiveness, the satisfaction of having twin heifers born. That was always a nice thing. Okay, next one. More about the family, and I'm just doing this to make a point about how important the family working together was to the whole picture of that farm. Farms of that type did not require big mortgages. They were all self-sufficient in food to the big extent. They were very thrifty, did not spend money unless they had to, and kept their place in good shape to keep the value up. The bottom picture is one that fairly unusual. Well, it's totally lost these days. That's a load of corn that was cut in the field by hand, of course, no corn chopper, and it was cut with scythes, and you would cut a bunch of it, pile it onto another bunch that was cut, and later on you would come and pick up these bundles, put them on a wagon, take them to the silo, and the silo had a chopper to chop the corn and blow it up into the silo from the top. The chopper was driven by usually a small tractor with a belt drive. All very simple, worked very well, very slow by today's standard, a lot of labor, but got the job done. And what was grown on that farm was done for the sole purpose of producing food for the family and food for the animals, and production of corn and other things and hay for the cows and the horses. All right, go on. This is a picture of myself and my daughter doing a pig slaughtering with a couple of kids helping with the lifter, with the block and tackle. This was a normal operation on many farms, and when there was a need to slaughter an animal, be it cow, pigs, chickens, it was usually done right on the farm. Most people knew how to do this stuff. The intricate meat cutting would usually be left to somebody more familiar with that type of stuff. My father and brothers were meat cutters and very well versed. My father was well versed in the slaughtering trades up in Canada and curing of meats and stuff like that. So this was a normal process, nothing to be scared of, because it was done for the purpose of providing food, and it was a treasured way to make use of the animal and not waste any part of it. Okay. Now here's a picture of a very advanced loose hay barn, not with a manure cellar, however. This barn would have had a manure conveyor in the gutters to take the manure away, rather than being dumped in a cellar. This is a beautiful operation. Must have been a dairy or some big, I don't know where it was, but it was a big operation. You can tell by the number of windows that there were many cows. They were probably milking, I'm going to guess, maybe close to 100 cows. And you see the windmill next to the house? That windmill was used to pump water for water pond in the pasture for the cows and also for the house. Okay. I want to make a note that pig farms provided meats, live starter, and mature pigs for the rest of the farmers. Feeds were grain and mostly swill, we called it swill, scavenged from the cities under competitive contracts. The farmers that had a lot of pigs would compete for contracts for certain sections, for different sections of the city. The third floor tenement housing on small lots all had trapdoor buckets in the backyard, and the swill collectors would come by with their little dump trucks, go in the backyards, pick out the bucket, dump the swill in the truck, bring the bucket back, and the people that would own the house would usually clean that bucket up with soap and water for the next time. So the swill, the pig farms of the day were very large, as the Semensky farm was, hundreds of acres, a lot of woodlands, and the pigs would scatter through the woodlands during the day, and when the swill trucks were due to come to different locations, the pigs would automatically flock out of the woods, come to the swill sites, and be there ready for the food. When the food was dumped, the pigs took care of that. So this is explained in this paragraph here, and pigs were loose. The important thing is the pigs were loose over large acreage and woods, and knew when feeding time would come. This made a fairly clean operation. The pigs would be eating the roots of the trees. The trees would die, and provide firewood, and that would help with the land clearing for more fields later. So the whole thing was kind of a symbiotic process. Okay. The giant farms are, well, right there in the short west part of Westport that I showed you, the Medeiros farm, Semensky's on Gifford Road, and Jarobek off Reed Road, all of them went out of business a long time ago. One of the problems with some of these farms is that somebody would build a housing development next to the farm and then start giving the farmers a lot of grief, continuous lawsuits and all kinds of stuff. And with time, that discouraged many of these operations. Ernie Waite on Division Road was one exception. That farm is still in operation. It's operated like the old days, a lot of land, no more swill. Ernie gets leftover grain from the spaghetti mills in Boston. The swill is pretty well gone from that operation. Ernie is the last of the old working Yankee farmers. He died a couple of years ago, left a written account of his remarkable life, which is assembled in a book available at Partners. And he's also on 3 videos that I filmed, that I recorded of him on the Westport Matters videos, who are now on the westporthistory.org, the Westport Historical Society site. Ernie's videos can be viewed on that site, the westporthistory.org site. Those 3 videos are there, and his book is available at his personal written book is written at Partners Village Store. Here we go. This is a picture of Ernie. He died well in his 90s. He was a sawmiller, a farmer par excellence, self-sustaining, very resourceful mechanic, and a master at animal husbandry. Ernie, I was always amazed. I only knew Ernie during the latter part of his life, but I was always amazed at his deep knowledge of the marketing and the whole subject, the welfare of the country and everything else. It's just a well thought out farmer's mind. Farmers of the day, well, farmers even today, but the farmers of the day always, in retrospect, strike me as having doctorate's degrees in their heads, because there was so much knowledge stored in there that you would write books. You could write books about it, but they would have a rough time expressing all of it because it was so ingrained. Okay. Ernie's farm, showing a very productive sow with piglets. They were running all over the place there. Now, we'll talk about chicken and turkey farms. This was a major local industry. Okay, we go to the next slide. All right, that's it. This was a very important industry in the local area. It saw a precipitous decline starting in the late 60s. This industry provided eggs, meats to the general public. Many farmers had their own retinue of steady customers, and some, like the Ledoux chicken farm and Glidden grain franchise of Swansea, had incubators that hatched large quantities of Rhode Island red chicks. Reds were in big demand because they were great layers, and they were at the time shipped countrywide in ventilated boxes of 100 chicks per box, usually 10 hens to 1 rooster, and usually shipped by trains. They could make it across country in 3 days. Okay. The raising of the chicks started under small coal brooder stoves, and you can see remnants of these chicken operations right on Old County Road in Dartmouth and Westport. Some chicks were summered in small broiler houses and allowed to roam freely in small areas of small acreage. You could raise hundreds of thousands without crowding them too badly as broilers for the fall slaughtering. Layers were transferred to coop compartments for the remaining time of their reproductive life. The egg stages progressed from pullet to jumbo stages with a different market for each, and the laying compartments included roosting poles and egg-laying nests. Removing the eggs from under the hens always invited a hand pecking from the offended hen, with the result that your upper hand would be fairly red all the time. Okay, this is a typical example of what used to be a giant chicken farm. It's on a corner of Horseneck and Higgs Bridge Road. The building is still there, used for other purposes. I think it closed, the farm chicken business closed around 1970. Next one. This is on the corner of, just up from Beeden Road. This is the Martell farm. This was a model farm. Ray Martell was very meticulous about his buildings. And after all of these years, these buildings have not been used for chickens, but they're still in perfect condition. Ray Martell was a perfectionist. Okay. Yergeau Farm, you'll recognize this house. It's across from the gravel pit, again on Old County Road. I slept in that house one night or two. I was friendly with the youngest son, Raymond, and Bob Harding actually knew these people very well also, and that's how Bob and I started talking together about farming. There was only one dairy cow for the family here, but the rest was chickens and turkeys. Okay? Now, beef farming in the U.S. is a major part of the beef supply, and the beef supply is amazing how much of it is from retired dairy cows. And a trick of my father would be to summer an older dried out cow to pasture, large Holstein, and serve a limited amount of grain and a slaughter late in the fall. The summer, through the easiness of the summer and the food supply, would make that meat tender, plentiful, good tasting, and it was a very economical meat supply. Now the beef industry locally is a relatively new local operations. One problem is the lack of local slaughter facilities, and that's probably going to be taken care of in the near future on Route 6. There's some works going on there. Slaughterhouses were very numerous around the area, starting with the Mid-City Steel, Mid-City Scrap, and the McDonald's, the Woods, Trips, and others that I can remember. There were many slaughterhouses around in those days. All right. Now, I've made a list by memory of survivor farms. I think this is a couple of years old, so there may be a couple of others. As you can see, I have 17 farms that are listed here as still surviving the farm decline. And there's vegetables and some dairy and other stuff here. There are, a couple of years ago, I documented about 40 farms that are out of business from my memory. And I'd be glad to make that memo available to anybody that wants it. If you just email me, I'll send you a copy. Okay? Now, new beef startup farms and pig farms, well, I have the Ernie Waite. I have a small summary here of beef farms, some of the newer farms that have startup beef farming, the grass-fed beef, no chemicals, the Ernie Waite Division Farm pigs, and the vineyards, of course, are Westport Rivers Vineyard, and there's a vineyard off of Sullivan Drive on the old Costa and the old remnants of the Costa and Goldstein farms. Now, I want to make a special point about where the Goldstein farm is. There's actually a crossing. There's actually a tunnel under 88 that's adequate to pass a small tractor and cows. Goldstein was one of the few successful lawsuit bringers against the state when they put 88 in to allow farm access to his lands on the other side of 88. So there is a small culvert under that part of 88 where the remnants of the Goldstein farm are. Okay. Then we go to the post-industrial era, the 60s to the 80s. We have an increase in open lands preservation. A lot of people with lands, and many with money, have sold their development rights to their land, so that there's a large amount of land now in Westport and Dartmouth that is permanently preserved, cannot be built on at times that follow. This has also promoted a lot of fallow land growth. The ground is sold for non-development and left to grow fallow, and ultimately it would grow back to forest if you can wait that long. Route 88, important here to note that this highway knifed through the whole length of Westport around 1958. It destroyed innumerable farms by dividing the lands from the farm buildings and the fields. The farmers who could not farm anymore sold the lands at deflated prices and spurred a massive development bubble in Westport from the 60s until the 80s. Other factors contributed to the sharp decline in Westport farming, but Route 88 was the prime catalyst that started that downfall. So overproduction from farmlands from the 40s to the 50s lowered the value of farm products and also contributed to many farm downfalls, but none of them so much as Route 88. To cope with the lower prices, many farms shifted to high-volume dairy. We had a farm shift from the small manure cellar barns to open barns and hundreds of cows. There's only one of those farms remaining, and one of the Ferry Boys doing a fairly successful, although very low price revenue operation on Narrow Avenue. There are a couple of other farms left in Westport that produce dairy, but we're down to just a few. The farms of the day are essentially monoculture farms requiring large use of lands to grow feed crops for such a big herd of cows. And it's mostly corn. So in the mid-70s, government grants paved the way for farmer retirements by providing money for not farming. All right, next one. To recap sustainable farm conditions, similar to the book farm, is that an important factor is that nutrients are absolutely necessary to agriculture. Sustainable farm practices of the past generated and used their own nutrient supply. Farm use and needs were set by the land type, the size, the wetland to dryland ratio, the energy needed to operate the farm, water availability, drainage, labor availability, and reconciliation of all those factors fixed the generation and distribution of nutrients. So the self-sustaining farms of the 50s lived within those conditions. A farm of about 60 acres with 1/4 woodlands and another quarter unimproved pasture could maintain a herd of 25 to 28 cows and a couple of workhorses. The farm's mainstay, around which all activities revolved, chickens, pigs, veal, rounded off the remaining animal needs, most of it used on a farm. Okay. To continue, such a farm required about 10 acres of corn, cow corn, 17 acres of hay, with the remainder for barn, buildings, and large garden. There was a windmill to pump water for the cows in the pasture, and a farm like this provided a frugal, satisfying livelihood for two families with continuous chores and work shared by all on a daily basis, varying with seasonal needs. It was really a good life. This was a carbon neutral operation. All manure generated was used on a farm. There was no excess. Nitrogen in plants is self-limiting. Low nitrogen, low growth. Lots of nitrogen, large growth, resulting in good or bad crop years. Next slide. It was a harmonious relationship with the land. similar to the Indian agriculture of 400 years ago. Self-sufficiency promoted this type of farming. This was an era of limited welfare and little farm subsidies. And we'll go to the thank you slide here. I want to mention that videos of the 3 farm talks can be viewed on Dartmouth Community TV, which is recording this stuff. I'm extremely pleased at how good the facilities are. It's certainly an asset to the town of Dartmouth, and I'm glad to be able to put this work to be viewed publicly by as many people as might be interested. And I can email a copy of the talk, but you can see it. You'll be able to see it on Dartmouth Community TV much better than an email. So, by a copy of the talk, I mean a copy of this slide presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll close by my usual love of life stuff. Thank you very much again, and thank you to Derek Freites and Jason Pratami for spending their time doing all this good stuff. Good night.